Hey, how's it going, everybody? Welcome back. Another episode in our whiskey history class. Today, we're going to look at the art of distillation. You ever wondered how we get this beautiful liquid in our glass that we can enjoy? Well, we know that spirits are distilled. So let's talk about distillation a little bit. Now, before we get into that, I do want to just jump in and say if you could give us a like, a comment, a subscribe, a share. All of that really helps as we're trying to continue to build the channel. Just hit that button. We greatly appreciate your watching, but give us the like and the subscribe as well, and share it to your friends. We greatly appreciate it. Now, let's get back to the good stuff. Distillation. Smells nice. So, before we get to distillation, beer, a lot of people know, they've been to brewery tours, they understand how that works. Spirits have a similar beginning, and that is what's called distiller's beer or mash. And that is using those grains. And again, uh, in the world now of craft whiskey, there's all sorts of things. There's oat whiskey, there's quinoa whiskeys, there's all sorts of things that we're experimenting with. But primarily worldwide, we use four grains: corn, rye, wheat, and malted barley. Of course, Scotch, single malt Scotch, is all 100% malted barley, just like an American single malt would be, some Irish single malts. And then in our American whiskeys, we have bourbon, which is corn dominant, rye, which is rye dominant. And then wheat, we have wheaters, we have wheat whiskeys, things of that nature. But those are the four primary grains. So those grains, whenever they figure out the mash or the recipe, what they want percentage-wise of those grains into their whiskey, they're going to mash that in, going to mill it, ground it, get it into the tank, and begin to work it, process it, do its thing. And they're going to basically make a beer, or the start of a beer. Once they get that done, they're going to send it over to fermentation, where they're going to pitch the yeast. The yeast is going to eat all the sugars, because that process of the mash or the brewing is converting the starches to sugars. That's the whole point. Taking starches, making them sugars, so that when we go to fermentation, the yeast eats the sugars. We begin to get some alcohol out of that process. From fermentation, we go to the stills, and we go to distillation. Now, what is distillation? Besides the fact that it gives us this beautiful stuff. So distillation is the process that involves the conversion of a liquid into a vapor, and then subsequently condensing it back to a liquid form. So it's evaporation and then recondensation. It's separating two or more liquids having different boiling points. Primarily when it comes to our whiskey, that's where the good things begin to happen. In the still, in that distillation process, as we're heating it, of course, in the ancient days, they would use coal, type of heat. Now, most modern distilleries are using steam fittings. And so as we're heating that mash, water and alcohol have different evaporation points or different boiling points. So as the evaporation begins to happen, then it rises in the still. Now, this can happen in your pot stills, in the line arm. This can also happen then, of course, in a column still, those big, tall, just round ones with the little hole windows and plates in them. And as it evaporates, liquid evaporates, and it begins to rise as a vapor. Eventually, it's getting far enough from the heat source that it begins to recondensate and trickle back down. Now, every time this process happens, we're losing product in the amount of, we're losing the liquid, we're losing what we started with, but we're gaining alcohol content. That, in a broad nutshell, is what distillation is. Now, distillation we can trace it back roughly to about 4000 BC to ancient Mesopotamia, which is today's modern Syria and Iraq. And then also Asia and ancient Babylon. They were distilling. They found this method of evaporation, of converting liquid vapor, perfumes, aromatics, eventually water, eventually some medicines, until we eventually get to the point of what we would call whiskey or a grain-based distillation. Now, Aristotle is noted, speaking of the distillation of water, and you can go into any local grocery store today and buy distilled water. That's still a thing. Okay, Aristotle is noted as saying that pure water is made by the evaporation of seawater. So they were taking the seawater and basically distilling it to pull out the salt and the impurities and clean and clarify it till it got to a pure, drinkable state. Now, one of the primary commentators of Aristotle wrote several years later, in writing at around 100 AD, but in reference to Aristotle, which would have been in about 2 to 300 BC, described this process that Aristotle's known to have made about taking pure water, is that of the evaporation of the seawater. Now, as knowledge of distillation grew, it traveled predominantly probably through the trade routes. The primary trade route back in those days would have been that of the Alexander the Great's Grecian, however you want to say that, empire. Vast empire, had many trade routes. So this art form of distillation began to move along the path. Now, it predominantly happened through Christian missionaries, monks, friars, and monasteries. They are the primary people who we can thank for our whiskey, for our wines, for our beers, our ales, and our meads. The Christian faith, the monks, the monasteries, the missionaries, played a predominant role in the production or the even invention of alcohol. So, cheers to that. Now, as the things begin to happen, that art form eventually hits Europe and gets into Ireland and Scotland, which to this day we would call the godfathers of distillation. Now, Ireland and Scotland are always going to argue on who was first, but we do have some clues. It's not going to solve their arguments because there's always going to be the argument. But the saying goes, history's written by the winners. What I mean by that is, all we have to go on is the written record. Now, the first written record that we have of what we would call whiskey distillation, a spirit distilled from grain, is recorded in 1494 in the Exchequer of Scotland. Now, I'm going to come back to that. There is a record in Ireland that predates it. It's in 1405 in the Irish Annals of Clonmacnoise, or something of that nature. But it's not about distillation. Now, obviously, distillation was happening somewhere for this to happen. But in that 1405 record, it states that a head of clan, quote, a head of clan died from a excessive amount of aquavita. Aquavita is the term that eventually we get to from whiskey. We'll talk about that in another video as well. But trust me, aquavita is the equivalent of whiskey. So we know that in Ireland, some dude drank too much and died. Not a happy ending. But we have no record of where that product came from, where that distillation happened. We could assume that it was in Ireland if he was in Ireland. But the fact is the first written record that we have of a distillation of whiskey is in 1494 in the Exchequer of Scotland, where it states that the King of Scotland issued 7 bulls of grain to Friar John Core for which to make aqua vita. That is the key. That is where we're going. And that is the first record of whiskey distillation. Now, alcohol distillation comes before whiskey distillation. In the late 1200s, Raymond Lull, who was a Christian apologist, a theologian, a missionary, and a philosopher, poet, and prolific author, he basically was taking wine that was something that was already being produced, obviously. Wine's been around for centuries and predates biblical times. And took the wine and distilled the wine to create even a stronger alcohol content, what we would today call brandy. And then a couple hundred years later, we see a grain being converted into an alcoholic content. Now, this will be in another video, so you can just kind of store this for the quiz later. But as I mentioned earlier, Raymond Lull, Christian missionary, apologist, theologian, Friar John Core, and there's others that we'll talk about. All the good stuff began through members of the Christian faith. So the next time some, holier than thou Christian wants to talk about how alcohol is bad, they might need to go back and check their history. Just saying. But we'll deal with that at every time. But for now, just know that distillation is something that is an art form that was learned years and years and years, literally thousands of years ago, out of necessity for drinking pure water, for medicines, for perfumes and aromatics, and then eventually into what we would call brandies and our modern whiskey. And that is how we get the good stuff. It's still the process we use today. Our stills are bigger. Our stills are more, they're not as rough looking. They're pretty. They're fancy. They're maybe a little bit more technologically sound in many ways for all of those things. But the process started thousands of years ago, and it's still the same process of that transference of a liquid to a vapor and back into a liquid. That's separating 2 or more liquids by their boiling points to create a stronger alcoholic content for our purposes in whiskey. Obviously, distillation is not all about alcohol, but that is where we get distillation. Still to this day, the same process, the same use. It's what we do, and it gives us this beautiful dram. Now, how we get from that distillation, from that still to the glass, we'll talk about that another time. But for now, it's a brief history of distillation. Hope you enjoyed. Appreciate your comments. Appreciate you all watching. We'll see you next time. Cheers.